Thank you very much for the opportunity to address this task force. My testimony today will concern just some of the enduring effects of 20th century urban renewal on African American communities in California. So you can think of my testimony here as focusing on numbers 2 and 3 on the list of harms that Dr. Appleyard enumerated, and as dovetailing, I think, very closely with the testimony of Dr. Archer. Urban renewal is a name we now use for several policies that provided federal funding to state and local governments for the purpose of remaking cities in partnership with private businesses in the middle decades of the 20th century. Those policies included, among others, the Federal Housing Acts of 1937, 1949, and 1954, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which, as you've heard, was particularly important, various state laws, such as California's Community Redevelopment Law of 1951, that authorized the creation of redevelopment agencies, and the local implementing actions that created redevelopment agencies and made use of them to condemn and redevelop property. In the mid-20th century, the policymakers and planners who led urban renewal efforts explicitly aimed to reduce density and to separate land uses from each other. Urban renewal was used to clear the land for the development of both privately owned structures and public infrastructure, especially, but by no means only, highways. Clearing the way for major infrastructure investments meant displacing existing land uses, including existing residential communities. By 1969, according to the estimates of the urban planning scholar Emily Talin, at least 910,000 units were demolished with financing from federal urban renewal programs. By her estimate, at least 330,000 of them specifically to make way for highways. As we've heard from Dr. Archer, that's a low estimate. Often plans for urban renewal called for replacement housing, but housing was not replaced on a one-for-one basis, and it often was not affordable to previous residents of a redeveloped area. The communities targeted for urban renewal were predominantly low income. Many of them were also disproportionately Black. One particularly well-known example in California is the Fillmore District in San Francisco. This diverse neighborhood was home to a large African American community when the San Francisco City Planning Commission declared it blighted and announced a plan for its redevelopment in 1947. The plan included major infrastructure investments, including new schools, parks, recreation facilities, and a freeway extension, along with thousands of new apartments for middle and upper income families. Not all of that development happened as planned, but the demolition did. The city planning scholar Clement Lai has reported that redevelopment of the area displaced 8,000 residents over the next 2 decades, many of them Black. It also displaced a small but important enclave of Black-owned businesses and community institutions that serve the broader African American community of San Francisco and beyond. Another especially well-documented example from California that you've heard about in Dr. Appleyard's testimony is West Oakland. Federal, state, and local government agencies demolished thousands of homes in this once thriving majority Black neighborhood in order to make way for new highways and light rail that would funnel commuters from the suburbs into San Francisco. The historian Robert Self has estimated that West Oakland lost between 6,600 and 9,700 housing units in the first 6 years of the 1960s, displacing, by his estimate, more than 10,000 people. Caltrans in the 1990s sponsored some oral history interviews with former residents of West Oakland. One such resident who was interviewed, Landon Williams, gave an oral history interview in which he recalled that in the 1950s, when he grew up there, it was a Black community with a vibrant commercial strip running through it until the Nimitz Freeway and the Bay Area Rapid Transit carved through the neighborhood. And in his words, they wiped it out and the ground lay fallow for like 10 years. For the African American communities in San Francisco, far outside the Bay Area. These examples both come from the Bay Area, but they're certainly not unique. Many other Black communities in California and beyond were disrupted by major transportation infrastructure investments. The economists Jeffrey Brinkman and Jeffrey Lynn have documented in a sample of 50 US cities that the predicted probability of freeway selection in 1966 was more than 6 percentage points higher for an all-Black neighborhood compared to an all-white neighborhood, holding constant other neighborhood characteristics. In other words, this wasn't merely a function of the fact that Black people tended to live near the urban core or in areas where it otherwise might have made sense to locate freeways. Although these urban renewal projects did bring major infrastructure investments into neighborhoods with residents, they also displaced many of those Black residents, and most of the people who enjoyed the benefits of the infrastructure investment were not the Black people who had previously lived in the neighborhoods. The costs of these infrastructure investments were shared by all taxpayers insofar as the investments were paid for in part by state and federal tax revenues. They also, however, had other kinds of costs, as you've heard, that were borne most especially by the previous residents who stayed in or were displaced from those neighborhoods. The cost to those who were displaced included the expense of moving, and in some unknown number of cases, an increase in their rent. Many of those who were displaced in most of these neighborhoods, perhaps a majority, were renters, and so any compensation provided under eminent domain went to their landlords rather than to them. The cost to those who remained included such disamenities as obstacles to travel within the neighborhood, as you've heard, barriers, the establishment of barriers, not just between Black and white neighborhoods, but cutting through the middle of many Black neighborhoods in California, new exposure to air pollution from nearby freeways, and these disamenities in turn imposed economic harms. For example, it could become much harder to sustain a small retail business when a freeway condemned the houses of your customer base and cut you off from foot traffic. The particular cost to the neighbors in an urban renewal area also included non-economic harms that are harder to quantify, but I think I'm echoing previous speakers when I say there's something priceless about having a community of friends and neighbors, and there's something lost when that community is cut off by infrastructure investments that do not serve your community. Although the flows of federal money for urban redevelopment and highway construction contracted in the 1970s, urban freeway construction and state-led redevelopment of the urban core continued. One way to document the ongoing legacy of redevelopment for Black communities is to compare the changing availability of housing in census tracts that were predominantly Black and census tracts that were predominantly non-Black. I'm going to report here briefly the results of an analysis of net housing units lost by census tract in California from 1970 to 2010. I believe Trini has my slides, and Trini, if you would go ahead and load them up now, if you can show the slides, that would be helpful. In the meantime, I'll describe the comparison I'm going to show you. Right, thank you. So this is a comparison of census tracts in California from 1970 to 2010. I am focusing in particular on only those tracts whose boundaries could be matched from 1970 to the boundaries of 2010 census tracts, to be sure that the comparison really is a before and after snapshot of the same place. This 40-year period after 1970 is after the period when the bulk of displacement that's associated with urban renewal happened. This is after the period that's conventionally regarded as the heyday of urban renewal, but it included the heyday of the California redevelopment agencies, the construction of hundreds more miles of freeways in California, and ongoing struggles over the location of urban infrastructure. This is the period in which additional freeway investments cut through communities in San Diego, for example, the 15 through the heart of the City Heights neighborhood. It also included many other events, such as fires and earthquakes, that may have reduced the number of housing units. So what I'm showing you here is simply whether lost housing units were replaced. Most California census tracts added more housing units than they lost after 1970, but some lost housing units overall. And those that lost net housing units after 1970 were disproportionately Black in 1970. The average percentage of residents who were Black in census tracts that would subsequently lose housing units was 26%. The average percentage of residents in neighborhoods that would subsequently gain net housing units over the next 40 years was 9%. So in other words, the neighborhoods that would lose housing after 1970 in California were disproportionately Black. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Another way to look at the same data is to compare majority Black neighborhoods, as I've said, to majority non-Black neighborhoods, and assess their likelihood of losing net housing stock over the next 40 years. That's what this graph shows. Among tracts that were majority non-Black in 1970, only 9% of those tracts in this sample that I was able to study lost housing units over the next 40 years. Among tracts that were majority Black in 1970, 31% lost net housing units from 1970 to 2010. And neighborhoods that lost housing also lost Black residents over this 40-year period. The census tracts in the sample that lost net housing units on average lost also an average of 229 Black residents over the period. The census tracts that gained housing units gained an average of 30 Black residents per tract over this period. So this is a story not just of the destruction of housing units in places that were majority Black, it's also a story of the dispersion of Black people throughout California. In short, many of the African-American residential communities that existed in California in 1970 would eventually lose more housing units to the bulldozer and the wrecking ball than they would gain from new investment over the next 40 years. I'll really briefly show a couple of maps to provide a visual illustration of the association between where African-American residential communities were located and where housing demolition subsequently removed more homes than were later built. It's a simple comparison. I don't have data here on where those housing units were specifically lost to infrastructure investments. Although I think you'll see from the aerial view here, if you're familiar with some of the cities I'm going to show, it won't be a surprise to see where some of those areas are. Next slide, please. So this is a patchwork map of Alameda County. You can see only some parts of the county are shown. That's because only some census tracts could be compared on an apples to apples basis from 1970 to 2010. So I'm again focusing on places where I can be really sure we're talking about the same place over time. The darker the gray here, the greater percentage of residents in the tract were Black. Of course, you can, if you're familiar with Alameda County, you can see that bit to the left there that looks like Jaws, that's around the port, and West Oakland is there. Just north of that is West Berkeley and Richmond, California. That's 1970, again, after the displacement of some 10,000 residents from West Oakland. Next slide, please. And yet housing units continue to be lost and not replaced in these census tracts after 1970. The dark gray here represents the tracts that lost more housing units than they gained over the next 40 years. The impression you should get here is simply that places that had substantial Black majorities or substantial Black populations in 1970 were places that were a little more likely than other places to lose more housing units than they gained. Next slide will show you Los Angeles County, just very briefly. So again, 1970, this shows you by census tract the percentage of residents who were Black in different census tracts in LA, darker gray meaning a higher percentage. And you can see there in South LA, of course, a familiar heart of much of the Black community in Los Angeles County. Next slide, please. And you can see again here, dark gray here representing where housing units were lost in greater numbers than they were gained. Once again, that's concentrated there in South LA, and it is in proximity to freeways and other infrastructure investments. These are places where urban renewal had previously happened, and what we see here is that these are also places where subsequent urban redevelopment continued to remove housing units faster than they were replaced in communities that were, in some cases, predominantly Black, and in many cases had substantial Black minorities in them. All right, that's all for my slides. Thank you. I'm going to conclude with some brief remarks here. Some caveats about the comparison. I've just showed you some very abstracted maps. Of course, I've not documented whether the destruction of housing units in one neighborhood was later made up by the construction of new housing units elsewhere in the same city. The data I presented doesn't tell us anything about what happened to the residents who were displaced, how many of those residents were worse off than they would have been in the absence of redevelopment. At a minimum, all I've shown with these data are that 40 years of redevelopment after 1970 yielded different amounts of housing in predominantly Black and predominantly non-Black neighborhoods. That descriptive comparison, though, I think is enough to tell us the legacy of urban renewal differed across neighborhoods. And it should also tell us that the stories of loss that have been passed down to us from residents of the Fillmore, from residents of West Oakland, and from residents of other urban Black communities like those places in California are not at all unique. Historians have recorded many of the stories of residents of those particular places, but the former residents of many other African American communities in California could recount similar histories. I'd like to conclude with some general remarks that I think might be relevant to the deliberations of the task force. First, the legacy of urban renewal in California included negative consequences that were sometimes felt by Californians of all races and ethnicities, but that were disproportionately felt by African American people who lived in predominantly African American communities. The net impact of urban renewal on wealth creation for African Americans has not yet, to my knowledge, been measured in dollars. That impact, though, I think may well have been negative in many cities, and the negative economic impacts of urban renewal on many Black individuals and families may be assumed to have compounded other well-documented harms associated with intergenerational dispossession and ongoing racial discrimination in housing and credit markets. Second, both public and private investments in infrastructure sometimes contributed to displacing Black people, Black-owned businesses, and Black community institutions. Many neighborhoods that were targeted for urban renewal badly needed new infrastructure, but in many cases that infrastructure was provided in a way that did not benefit residents of those neighborhoods, and in fact it harmed them while benefiting others. It would be fair in many cases to describe this, I think, as exploitation. Third, I would also note that the effects of urban renewal on community institutions in some predominantly African American neighborhoods might be regarded as a collective injury. By that I mean that it harmed Black people who may not even have lived in that neighborhood. To the extent that the opportunity for Black people to live in the same places, in the same urban neighborhoods with other Black people, created new opportunities for Black people's economic empowerment in the middle decades of the 20th century, for greater opportunities for Black political power at that time. We might regard the disruption caused by urban renewal as a kind of collective harm affecting even Black people who lived outside of the places where the most disruptive impacts happened. And the last point I'd like to conclude with is that urban renewal took place within living memory. The legacies of urban renewal include physical infrastructure such as freeways that still divide neighborhoods, organizations such as redevelopment agencies that persisted for decades after urban renewal, and processes of neighborhood transformation that have continued to take place long after the middle decades of the 20th century that historians regard as the time of urban renewal proper. To the extent that urban renewal caused harms and the legacy of urban renewal caused harms to African American communities that could be addressed by reparations, those harms do not lie in the distant past. Our elders remember them. And that is where I will conclude my testimony. Thank you.